All right, everyone, now we're turning to the next session where we're going to be discussing disinflation in the stock market, Third World Lessons for First World Monetary Policy by Anusha Chari and Blair Henry. So Peter is the class of 1984 Senior Fellow at Hoover, Senior Fellow at Stanford's Institution of International Studies, and the Dean Emeritus of Stern. Being a Dean Emeritus sounds like a great job. Actually.
Much better than being dean.
Yeah, much better than being dean. I encourage you all to read the bios in the program for both of our presenters, which is extraordinarily impressive. Among other things, Peter was a college finalist in a slam dunk competition, so that's something we have in common, actually. So, and you're to speak for 25 minutes. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Bill Nelson. I'm the chief economist at the Bank Policy Institute. And as a discussant, Josh Rao, who's the Orman Family Professor at the Business School here, as well as a senior fellow at Hoover. And Josh, you have 20 minutes to present your discussion. I wanted to just say, Peter, I thought this was just a remarkably clear and paper, very much on topic. It draws on, as you all will shortly hear, it draws on EME, emerging market economy experiences to help inform a very pressing current policy debate here in developing countries of how costly it is to fight inflation, using 81 new episodes. The bottom line being that it's easier to reduce high inflation over 40% than it is moderate inflation, and with the clear implication that the Fed should drive inflation up above 40% before commencing to reduce it. But a more senior implication, of course, is that one that I think the FOMC could have learned from over the last couple of years is that things aren't always necessarily going to go the way you expect them to go, and this could be a tough slog. Don't just base your communications and plans on your baseline outlook. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank John Taylor and congratulate John Taylor. But I want to just set a personal note. When I was an assistant professor at Stanford Business School in 1997, I still have a letter that I received from the then chairman of CEPR, John Taylor, providing me with a very generous stipend to study issues facing developing countries and macroeconomic issues. And that grant was really the seed that really helped fund really a lifetime of research. So John, thanks very much. All right, so this paper is joint work with Anusha Chari, who's at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a member of the National Bureau of Economic Research. So we ask a very simple question. Can Federal Reserve officials quickly and at low cost to employment and output reduce inflation to the 2% target? Simple question. So there are really two opposing schools of thought about this question. The first school of thought I would call the sacrifice ratio school that I learned very well in graduate school. And the sacrifice ratio school, in answer to that question, would basically say, as during the Volcker episode, the journey back to stable prices will be painful and protracted because disinflation requires a fall in output in accordance with the Phillips curve, long line of literature documenting the impact and measuring the sacrifice ratio. Then there's the this time is different school. The this time is different school, I think, was summarized well by John Lipsky and some others, and basically think of financial market participants who don't really believe that the Fed is going to do what they say they're going to do, and that we don't have to have a long and protracted recession in order to get back to this 2% inflation target. And the Fed's going to soon pause and or start cutting rates. And if you're a part of the this time is different school, you might look for comfort in Tom Sargent's famous 1982 paper. And in Tom's paper, just to remind you, he finds that in the aftermath of World War I, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Poland were all able to, by credibly shifting their monetary and fiscal policy, right, they were able to rapidly reduce inflation, stabilize prices with little cost to employment and or output. All right, so there's two opposing schools of thought. What I want to argue, to start off with, is that the trouble with the this time is different school of thought is that, number one, There's been no change in US fiscal policy. The federal deficit was 5.4% of GDP in 2022. It'll be 5.3% in 2023, and it's forecast to climb on average between now and 2033. And that's what the Congressional Budget Office tells us that. And full disclosure, my son works at the Congressional Budget Office, but he was not involved in producing these particular forecasts. Number two, even after raising the federal funds rate at a record-setting pace, it is not at all clear that monetary policymakers, having let the genie out of the bottle in the first place, have met what I would call the Sargent 1982 standard of a credible regime shift. Furthermore, I want to say in this paper that both the sacrifice ratio and the this time is different view suffer from what I would call a small sample problem. Right, so all of the talk about this disinflation episode in the United States has really been in reference to the Volcker episode, the 1970s and 1980s. And in general, it's hard to infer how long and costly the current US disinflation path will be by comparing it to one, and really the only US disinflation episode on this order of magnitude. Right, we've got essentially one data point. So, in contrast to this singular focus on the Volcker episode, in this paper, I want to use historical experience, the experience of developing countries' attempts to actively engineer disinflation as a set of quasi-laboratory experiments to ask, will the Fed be able to achieve a rapid, low-cost return to 2% inflation? Let me just tell you right now what the conclusion is. A soft landing by the Fed is unlikely. You can define that in different ways. Basically, I think about that as, will they be able to quickly return to 2% inflation? I began writing this paper in February. The landing has already been, I would argue bumpy. And I think the data that I'm going to show you really suggests, not me, the data suggests that a soft landing is unlikely. And another way to think about a soft landing is, will we have sort of higher rates for longer, or will they come down sooner? And again, I think the data are going to suggest that higher for longer is much more likely. And in the process of drawing this conclusion, the paper, I think, makes two contributions. The first contribution, as I've already alluded to, is just more power. Right? So I'm going to talk about, or summarize really, the data on 81 disinflation programs across 21 developing countries between 1973 and 1994. And of these 81 programs, 56 programs were directed at what are called moderate inflation, as defined by Dornbush and Fisher in their 1983 World Bank Economic Review paper, Moderate Inflation. And so moderate inflation is going to basically mean double-digit inflation, but inflation that's below the 40% high inflation threshold that was defined by Bill Easterly and Michael Bruno in their work in 1996. All right, so we got 56 moderate inflation episodes and 25 high inflation episodes. Now, I should just say offhand, you may be thinking, well, okay, developing countries, what can we really learn from developing countries? They're so different. Well, actually, if we actually look at the moderate inflation episodes, the 56 moderate inflation episodes, the median inflation rate in those 56 episodes was actually 15%. Okay? So just by comparison, UK peak inflation in October 2022 was 11.1%. EU peak inflation, October 2022, 10.7%. The US, 9.1%, okay, not quite 10, but same order of magnitude. And during the Volcker episode, 11% was peak inflation. So in the moderate inflation episodes that are going to be a core part of the discussion here, the median inflation rate is pretty similar to what we've seen in this disinflation episode. Very important point. Moderate inflation is actually quite different than high inflation. And the stock market, which is going to be the next point that I make, the second contribution in this paper is to use new methodology. Okay? So I'm going to use stock market data from the 21 developing countries to provide a cost-benefit analysis of disinflation. It seems kind of straightforward, but if you think about it, the central issue in disinflation is not really how costly is it in the short run, but whether the benefits outweigh the costs. Right? So we've had disinflation efforts all around the world for the past 4 decades, and presumably policymakers don't attempt to reduce inflation unless it's in the broader national interest to do so. But if the benefits of disinflation actually outweigh the costs, it's nowhere articulated in the literature. So in contrast to the exclusive previous focus on costs, by accounting for benefits, the stock market analysis that we bring into this paper highlights the fundamental issue of net present value. So just think about it. When a disinflation program gets announced, in the short run, higher rates, potentially lower output. From the stock market's point of view, the stock market hears about whether the long-run benefits, i.e. whether there'll be higher growth in the future. If there's higher growth in the future, that's going to be associated with higher corporate profits and potentially lower discount rates in the future when interest rates come back down to more normal levels. In the short run, of course, interest rates rise, and in the presence of high inflation, there can be impacts on the risk premium. So just think of the aggregate equity premium, right? As the variance of profits comes down, as the variance of profits comes down, the discount rate or the aggregate equity risk premium also potentially comes down. So in other words, there's a long and short run trade-off here. And the stock market's reaction to the announcement of a disinflation program, at least in principle, is going to capitalize all that into the stock price over the period of time in which the market's learning about the authorities' intention to announce and implement a disinflation program. So we think there's a methodological contribution in this paper as well. And so let me just summarize briefly kind of what do we learn. So this is a graph of the cumulative abnormal return, the response of the stock market to high inflation episodes versus moderate inflation episodes, to the announcement of a disinflation program in the midst of those two different kinds of inflation. And the first thing that sort of jumps out from the picture is, from the stock market's point of view, trying to get rid of moderate inflation is very different than trying to get rid of high inflation, right? So if you're thinking about that this time is different school of thought, trying to take comfort in sort of the Sargent view of the world, what these data are telling us is that moderate inflation and high inflation are very different animals, okay? And so let me just tell you a little bit more about the differences between moderate and high inflation. So in the high inflation cases, as I've said, there are 25 episodes. In moderate inflation cases, there are 56 episodes. The average cumulative abnormal return in the high inflation cases is positive 44% over this kind of 12-month window from month minus 12 to month 0, which is the month of implementation. In the moderate inflation episodes, the cumulative abnormal return is actually negative 24%. So the net difference between the high inflation and moderate inflation cases is 68 percentage points. And that difference is both obviously economically significant, but it's also statistically significant. I won't go into the details of the regressions, but there's lots of details in the paper, whether we do this using real dollar returns, which I've reported here, or local currency returns controlling for the possibility the exchange rate is overvalued and a whole range of external factors. This picture and this result basically holds up. And so the statistical result is really not in question here. I think the most interesting thing to think about is really, what's the right interpretation? So let me just tell you a little bit about the difference between the moderate inflation episodes and the high inflation episodes. So it's really interesting. So of the 56 attempts to get rid of moderate inflation, to go from moderate inflation, double-digit inflation, to single-digit inflation, only 5 are successful. Right? So the first thing just to realize is it's hard to get rid of moderate inflation. Okay? 5 are successful. And by the way, all 56 moderate inflation episodes are identified using agreements between the countries and the International Monetary Fund. So even with IMF sponsorship, only 5 out of 56 moderate inflation attempts to reduce moderate inflation are actually successful. All right, so in the high inflation cases, the failure rate is also quite high. So only 8 out of 25 attempts to reduce high inflation succeed. But those efforts are much more concentrated. So 17 of the 25 episodes are in Argentina and Brazil, okay? So 17 of the 25 failures are in Argentina and Brazil. So once you get rid of Argentina, once you put aside Argentina and Brazil, you've now got 8 attempts to reduce high inflation. Outside of Mexico and Peru, which are those are the only 2 countries that required, of those 8 that I just mentioned, more than 1 attempt to reduce high inflation. In every other case, countries reduce high inflation to moderate inflation on the first try. All right, so in other words, outside of Latin America, going from high to moderate inflation, I wouldn't say it's a straightforward exercise, but the failure rate is actually 0. The success rate is 100%. So moderate inflation and high inflation are substantively very different, and the stock market is really reflecting that there's something very different about these high inflation episodes than the moderate inflation episodes. Okay, let me move on because I want to make sure that I stay with my time limits here. So let's talk a little bit about moderate versus high inflation in terms of actually inflation reduction itself. So this is just a graph of, on average, kind of what happens during the transition from either high inflation to moderate inflation, which is the blue line, or from moderate inflation to low inflation, which is the orange line. And the high inflation graph is plotted on the left-hand scale. So what you see is just that moderate inflation just appears to be much more persistent. Right? So high inflation is reduced to kind of the moderate inflation levels sort of within a year. And it takes 3 years to go from moderate inflation levels to sort of single-digit inflation. And if you just think about kind of the U.S. context, so you might quibble and say, okay, we started at 9.1% inflation, not strictly double-digit inflation. We're now at roughly 5% inflation. So we've come down by, we've reduced inflation by 4 percentage points. And that's not entirely consistent with this kind of slower reduction, slower return to moderate inflation you see more generally in the data here, right? So the initial kind of reduction happens relatively quickly, but it's a much more protracted, kind of a longer picture to get down, in this case, to sort of 10% inflation. And then, of course, in the current circumstance, the goal is 2%. And that's just a lot lower than 10%. So if you think of the orders of magnitude of kind of here going from kind of, roughly kind of 24% to 10%, and us trying to go from 9 to 2, don't want to overstate the case, but looks a lot more like the moderate inflation time horizon than the high inflation time horizon that we're dealing with in the current circumstance. So let me also talk a bit about what actually happens to output. And again, I don't want to overemphasize these pictures because, again, I've already told you that the numbers are actually pretty small here in terms of the number of data points, right? So there are only 5 cases of actually successfully reducing moderate inflation and 8 cases of successfully reducing high inflation. But it's still actually worth looking beyond the stock market to actually what actually happens to real output and to see whether there's a consistent picture here. So the picture is consistent in the following sense. So if you look at the high inflation cases, which are, again, the blue line, what do you see? Sort of on impact, in sort of years -1 to year 0, when the disinflation program is actually implemented, there's actually a jump in output, right? So the output growth actually goes up by 3.7 percentage points on average across the 8 countries. And the average growth rate of GDP in years, from years 1 to 3, in comparison to years -3 to -1, actually goes up by 4.6 percentage points. So in other words, on average, output growth is higher post-disinflation in the high inflation cases than it is pre-disinflation. And you see just the opposite in the case of the moderate inflation episodes. So on impact, there's a small fall in output. Output falls by 2 percentage points. And if you look at output growth pre-disinflation and post-disinflation, what you see is that the average growth rate of output of GDP post-disinflation falls to about 5.5 percentage points per year versus 6.9 percentage points per year pre-disinflation. So that's a 1.4 percentage point fall in output growth. And if you compare that to the high inflation cases where you've got a 4.6 percentage point increase, there's just sort of a difference in difference, right? That basically, again, small sample size here, But the point is that the picture here is not inconsistent with the message you get when you actually look at the stock market, that reducing high inflation is just a very different kettle of fish than reducing moderate inflation. I should also mention, just for kind of historical interest, I mean, maybe Sebastian Edwards will talk about this tonight, the one country that actually successfully reduces both high inflation and then almost 20 years later successfully reduces moderate inflation is Chile. So the high inflation episode in Chile is in 1978, and then interestingly in December of 1990, Chile announces the beginning of inflation targeting. And so they very gradually reduce inflation over a period of 5 years where they gradually reduce the inflation target. They reduce inflation from about 20% in 1990 to something around 8% in 1995, and they keep inflation in single digits until 2021. So the point of actually mentioning Chile is that if you think about this picture of this sort of what I'm labeling persistence of moderate inflation, and it could be that there's something structurally different about moderate inflation, or it could just be that policymakers, kind of lack the credibility in developing countries in moderate inflation circumstances to actually reduce it more quickly. And Chile is an interesting example because they just take a more gradualist approach. So if policymakers in general are taking a more gradualist approach to reducing inflation, to reducing moderate inflation, then that could explain why you see a picture that looks like this, absent any deeper structural differences between moderate inflation and high inflation. But whatever the case may be, I'm just describing the data here. I think the Chilean example is an interesting example. Let me, before I close, how much time do I have here, Bill?
25 minutes.
Okay.
In total. I don't know how much you have.
So I think I've got about, we'll call it 5 minutes. Just going back to the picture on high versus moderate inflation. So if you think about this result, right, and you can almost think about the revaluation of the stock market that takes place as kind of the probability of success of the program, times the change in valuation conditional on success. And then you realize, gee, moderate inflation episodes from the stock market's point of view actually are value destructive. So what's going on? Well, there are a number of ways to think about this. The first point to make is that when you're looking at the stock market, it's one reason why you want to actually pursue disinflating in the case of moderate inflation, even though you've got a negative stock market reaction, right, is that the alternative of not reducing inflation is worse. Right? We know from lots of studies by the World Bank that moderate inflation tends to become high inflation. So you don't want to leave moderate inflation to go unchecked because things could actually be worse. But also it's important to remember the stock market revaluation is measuring a change in wealth, not a change in utility. Right? So for example, you could get a productivity shock, right, in principle, which raises discount rates and actually leads to a fall in asset values that's actually welfare improving. So it's just important to remember the stock market's measuring wealth, not measuring utility per se. And then it's also important to recognize or ask the question, are the valuation effects that we're seeing a result of redistribution? Right? So for example, you could argue, or one might think, I mean, if it's the case that in high inflation episodes, there's just a redistribution of income from labor to capital, that could explain the results, except that if we actually go back to the data I showed you in output, it doesn't seem as though there's a zero-sum element here because actually output growth is actually going up in the case of reducing high inflation. Now, in reducing moderate inflation, the picture is different, as we've seen. There appear to be output losses. And so it's just a question I raise for speculation, just something to think about. If it is the case that there are distributive impacts of reducing moderate inflation, let's say reducing moderate inflation is better, redistributes income from capital to labor, for instance, right? In that case, even though moderate inflation is going to, as we see, is value destructive from a shareholder point of view, there could be popular support for proceeding with the reduction of moderate inflation, even though there are wealth losses. And it's just worth thinking about, because as the latest data that I've seen, maybe others have seen more recent, the general public in the United States wants inflation to be eradicated, at least brought to much lower levels, even as many financial market participants don't like so much the Fed is raising rates. So one just wonders whether there's something in the differing proclivities or penchants that people have for their preferences in regards to the level of inflation that's worth thinking about as to why moderate inflation is so hard to reduce from a political economy perspective. All right, so let me just end by saying whether in advanced economies or the developing world, no team of policymakers has ever executed an immaculate reduction of inflation from moderate to low, akin to what we have seen in the vanquishing of high inflation's past. And I failed to mention that in the Dornbush and Fisher paper, in addition to the 81 episodes the 56 moderate inflation episodes that I studied, Dornbush and Fisher in their paper actually looked at two advanced economies, Italy and Spain. Those are the only two advanced economies they could find that went from moderate to low inflation. And there were big output losses in both, sorry, not Italy and Spain, Spain and Ireland. And in both of those cases, there were big output losses. So that's the basis on which I say there may be some episode that I don't know about, but as far as I know, across my work and what I've looked at in Dornbush and Fisher, there's no team anywhere that's ever accomplished this. So ironically, the stock market, which in the US has been yearning for signs that interest rates will not remain higher for longer, actually provides, I think, the strongest evidence that a quick return to the Fed's 2% target is unlikely. And policymakers and financial markets ignored this lesson at their own peril. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Nice job.
Okay, thanks very much. As I lower the microphone here, I was at a dinner last night and I was sitting next to Art Laffer, and we stood up. I had been arguing with him about something a little bit, and he said, I heard a word, I thought he said attitude. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, you hear what I said? It turned out he said altitude. I like your altitude. So he and I have a similar altitude. Peter and I have a different altitude. First of all, thanks very much to John. Congratulations on the 30 years of the Taylor Rule, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to discuss this paper by Chari and Henry on disinflation in the stock market. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm not a monetary economist. I am a finance economist, and my research expertise is on fiscal policy, although I do a lot on valuation and discounting. So hopefully through that lens I'll be able to say something that might be useful. But the first thing I'll just say is I really enjoyed reading this paper and learned a lot from it, and recommend that you all read it as well. And I do think that one can learn a great deal from this technique of looking at other countries that have gone through disinflationary or attempts at disinflation and what has happened to markets when they've done so. It's a very nice paper, and I learned a lot from reading it. So essentially the paper is asking us, okay, if we're going to get from here to there, where here is we in the US are experiencing moderate inflation, and there is the Federal Reserve's 2% target, what should we expect the stock market to do based on the experience of other countries? And as Peter did a great job of describing the paper and its work and its results, so I won't go through too much detail about it, but it studies 21 countries, 81 disinflation programs, so that means that a number of these countries have multiple disinflation programs. And it uses a finance event study methodology. And so one of the things I'm going to talk a little bit about is just the timing, the chosen event window. So the event begins, or the sort of time zero for the event is 12 months prior to the announcement of an intention to stabilize inflation or to engineer disinflation by signing an official agreement with the IMF. So it's 12 months prior to the official announcement. The idea is that there is some foresight into this disinflationary attempt that's going to happen. And then the outcome is the 12-month stock return. So we're looking at a time period that is from a year before the actual signing of the official agreement or formal announcement up until the date of that event. And the key sample split, as Peter described, was looking at cases where inflation was high, defined as greater than 40% over the time period. This is 24 months to 1 month before the announcement of the disinflationary attempts, and then the moderate is where inflation was in the 10 to 40% range during that two-year period. So here's a world map of the countries affected by moderate or high inflation. So you can see a lot in Africa and Latin America, a few in Africa, Turkey, India, and some other Asian countries. Here's a graphical representation of the results, just as I see them, if we just sort of take out the lines going over time and just look at a histogram. And I put up here actually both real dollar returns and real local currency returns from the regressions. Peter didn't really have time to talk about this, but they're actually quite similar, which was something I was wondering about. For the high inflation countries, it's actually identical, taking his monthly coefficients and multiplying them by 12. You get 48% increase in stock market values over this over the measured time period. Same for the real local currency returns. For the moderate, the hit that Peter measures from doing the disinflation is lower in the real local currency return setting, which I thought was somewhat interesting. If we think about what might be going on in currencies, really we think that the disinflation is strengthening the currency. So I guess my intuition would have suggested you might have expected better dollar returns, but maybe the difference isn't that significant, and maybe it's not a big issue. But I'd like to sort of think more about what's actually going on with the currencies in this. The paper emphasizes results in dollar returns, so I'm going to focus on that. So first comment is on timing. The paper is essentially looking at the stock market returns over this time period, 12 to 0, and these are the returns that are measured in the regression. And during this time, we see that the high inflation is already coming down. So there's some effect happening in anticipation of the formal announcement of the program. There could be real actions also happening in the run-up to that formal signature. And the reason I highlight the range, though, is that it does appear that in the high inflation episodes, the time period over which the authors are measuring stock returns is one where the inflation is already coming down, whereas in the moderate episodes, it's a time period where the inflation is actually continuing to accelerate. So that's one kind of setting that we have to be aware of as we think about what's going on with the stock market in each of these instances. And then the graph actually that Peter showed extends out, so you can see what's going on in the stock market after the main period that's in the regressions. It extends it out for another 6 months or so, and the stock market's pretty flat at that point. But that's a time period where moderate inflation is actually, the moderate inflation countries are still seeing increases in inflation during that time period. So a natural question that I had when looking at that was, what happens to markets after the moderate inflation countries start to cool? And another point that came up in the presentation is, as Peter mentioned, there are only 5 cases of what Peter's defining as successful exit from a moderate inflation, getting below that 10% threshold. But there is these are countries where we're seeing an increase first in inflation and then a decrease in inflation. It is coming down to 10%. So I think I think it'd be fair to say there is some decrease going on in inflation. It does come down, although it's also going up during the time period where there's the stock market is being measured. So I think maybe a little bit more, it'd be helpful to me to understand a little more what's going on, just to present some more, a few different windows of stock market behavior that might allow us to kind of understand that in the context of what's going on with inflation in these two sets of sample countries. Okay, my second comment is on valuation. So, and Peter also foreshadowed this in his comments. Thinking about why do we think the stock market should behave or should react to disinflationary attempts by the central bank or by the government? And if we think about the valuation of the stock market as being a present discounted value of expected free cash flows, I'm going to just use unlevered enterprise value. You're not going to think about leverage in doing this. That's the standard valuation equation, and the discount rate is going to be a risk-free rate plus a risk premium, where each cash flow is discounted by a point on the yield curve that's appropriate for that cash flow, is matched to that cash flow. And so, RFT over all the T's, that represents the real risk-free yield curve, and that is what the Fed is kind of directly increasing parts of it to fight inflation. The central bank is, directly increasing the real risk-free yield curve, and so that's, if we think about what might be going on, that kind of makes sense. That is, that parts of that go up. The Fed directly controls the near term, but of course, a lot of stock market valuation is really about the longer term. It's kind of clear why stock market values might decline. So here's a set of hypotheses or conditions that would explain the results, which is that when the central bank starts fighting inflation, each free cash flow at a given time t is now discounted by a higher discount rate, periodic discount rate, and probably there's bigger increases at the front end of the curve than at the longer end of the curve, just because the longer end of the curve is not directly as much in the central bank's control. Of course, there are many things central bank can do in terms of buying or selling government securities at the longer end. And so then what's going to happen is that the valuation is going to decline because of that, because of the change in the discount rate. And also the free cash flow, the expected free cash flows are going to change as fewer investment opportunities are positive NPV. So that's kind of my finance way of translating what Peter was saying, the idea that lower macroeconomic growth is going to mean lower profits. I guess I'm sort of thinking of that in terms of they're going to, investment opportunities that might have been positive NPV at a lower discount rate are now no longer positive NPV and are not going to create profit for the company. And so we can explain the results by thinking that in cases of high inflation, that the inflation per se might be very, very detrimental to the real cash flows that the firm is going to experience. We have inflation of above 40%, that's creating actual real problems for the firm, whereas moderate inflation per se might not be that detrimental to real free cash flows. If inflation is expected and at 2% versus expected and at 10% or expected and at 20%, if it's all expected, there's no economic model that's going to distinguish among those things. Of course, where the costs are coming in is if these higher levels of inflation are indicative of possible future unexpected increases in inflation or risk that inflation might suddenly get a lot higher. And if those risks increase as the level of inflation increases, then I think the results in the paper are understandable through this framework. So I started thinking to myself, okay, let's just make an assumption that the average duration of the cash flows in the valuation is 10 years. It might be significantly longer, but just as an illustrative example, let's just take that as being the average time horizon. And I just was thinking about, okay, if the real yield in the bond market rises from, say, 0% to 1.5%, that's a pretty close approximation of what we see in the U.S. I guess maybe the real yield in the U.S. maybe a couple of years ago was more like negative 0.5%, and is now maybe 1.5%. But just for the sake of illustration, let's say it goes from 0% to 1.5%. That's a 14% decline in the valuation of the stock market. So we can sort of motivate it through that. How high do real yields actually have to go in order to fight moderate inflation or to bring moderate inflation back back down to the target levels, or put another way, since they don't always succeed, how much do central banks actually increase real yields during these times where they are trying to get out of moderate inflation or trying to get out of high inflation? And of course, they don't usually have as much impact on this medium to longer end of the yield curve. They're looking at the shorter end of the yield curve, but the valuation impact might be more on these longer horizons, which also responds. I think the point I want to make is that what's going on with this medium to long term end of the bond market, the response that has to the Fed's policy is going to be very relevant for what we actually see happening in markets. So on the right-hand side, this just shows, okay, if we go from, say, 0% to 10% real yield, these are we're entering the realm of countries that might be, looking at very, very big swings. That would be a 61% decline in the value of the stock market. So, so that's sort of how I would conceptualize it. And in order to understand the results even better, I thought it might be useful to go and look at a few countries that I just picked at random out of the sample in the paper, and try to look at just how much did the real yield actually go up in these countries, or what's the range of real yield. So since I didn't have the data on the exact episodes of when these inflationary episodes occur, I can't really do something exact where I say, okay, in India there was an inflation fighting episode and the real yield went up from 0% to 5%. But I can see that in India, it was around 0%. In the around 10 years ago, that was a time when inflation was quite high, and those real yields went up to about 5%. In part in order to bring that inflation down. Brazil, you can see a similar pattern where for a while real yields are sort of around zero. But during the time when inflation, preceding the time when inflation also seems to be coming down, real yields come up a lot. There, the maximum 10-year real yield was about 4.6% over this time horizon. Turkey, a country which I think in recent years we'd say they're experiencing high inflation, this actually gets cut off because it goes much above, it spikes up to much above the chart. But the maximum real yield over, I think, the episodes that the authors are looking at in this paper is 11.25%. So the real yield had to go up to over 10% in order to take care of inflation, or at least to address inflation. Maybe it didn't take care of it, but to address it the way that the central bank was attempting to address it. And Mexico, real yield topped out is about 6.5%. So maybe that informs a little bit how we might think about the results in this financial valuation context, going back to this, that we might be looking in these developing country contexts of the real yield. I guess I'm kind of thinking about that as the valuation yield for real cash flows, going up from 0% to 5% or even 10%. And so then I started to wonder, well, is a finding that fighting moderate inflation only hits the stock market by 18%, is that, would I really maybe even have expected it to be larger? Or is what's actually going on that it would have been larger, but maybe it actually is true that it is beneficial for the cash flows of the company not to have to worry a lot about moderate inflation spiking up into very, very high inflation. And so therefore, maybe the costs of moderate inflation are actually being reflected in the free cash flows. So that was kind of how I was sort of conceptualizing the results. And I think my suggestion for the paper is maybe just talking a little bit about valuation impacts and some of the ranges of where the rates, the valuation yields might be going would be valuable. Third comment, are these countries valid comparisons? Peter addressed this to some extent, but I think we might want to discuss it a little bit more. Is the U.S. more comparable to a low inflation situation than a moderate inflation situation? We never broke 10%. The kind of G7 countries that Peter mentioned were in the 9 to 11% range. That's the very low end of what you're calling in the paper moderate inflation. And so I wonder whether one could draw sort of a circle around countries that addressed kind of 5 to 15% inflation, and maybe that might be informative for what we might expect from the U.S. Also, just wondering about whether the U.S. history of cooling inflation in the 80s is relevant. We, in contrast to most of the sample countries, did have a successful episode of bringing down inflation. So maybe that is going to bring more confidence in the Fed's ability to actually do it, which will require less increases in these valuation yields and will hit the stock market maybe a little bit less. And finally, wondering about what might be going on the currency side of things, just based on the position of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency, will it maybe not weaken as much during our inflationary episodes as it might have in emerging market currencies, and so then the reversals might not be as severe. Other questions just leading into the discussion. I think I'm pretty much out of time. In economic models, the cost of expected moderate inflation is just not that high. So presumably, the reason that the Fed is fighting moderate inflation is to demonstrate credibility to respond quickly to unexpected inflationary shocks. It was painful that inflation went up from sort of bumbling along at 2%, we're all expecting to suddenly being at 10%. And so the reason presumably is say, okay, now we're in this moderate inflation realm, we're going to fight this, we're not just going to say, well, now you're going to live with 10% inflation going forward, is because by setting the precedent that they can respond quickly to unexpected inflationary shocks, it can limit the damage to those unexpected inflationary shocks. And I'll just end with asking the question, do we think the value of that moderate inflation fighting is actually showing up in stock prices today? I mean, on the one hand, I think the paper's conclusion is that markets don't seem to see moderate inflation fighting as being net positive given the paper's headline findings. But on the other hand, the valuation hits might be even larger if the market didn't perceive the value of moderate inflation fighting. Actually, it could well be that moderate inflation is actually costly for firms, particularly under the expectation that it could get a lot worse or it could spike into a higher inflation setting. So maybe that will motivate the discussion a little bit. But I really appreciate this paper. And I guess one final comment I'll mention on the redistribution question. I think Hanno Lustig, who I see in the audience, not going to cold call you, Hanno, but he has a lot of work on how the lowering in interest rates has impacted the income and impact the wealth distribution. And so since much of this inflation fighting is intimately linked to raising real interest rates, and much of the valuation impacts in the stock market are about how those increases in real rates are affecting the longer end of the yield curve and hence the kind of appropriate valuation discount rates for stocks. It may well be that going in reverse is going to have the opposite effect on wealth distribution. And so I think that's a valuable point to bring into the paper. So thanks very much.
So thank you, Josh, for really helpful comments. I agree with everything you said. In particular, I think it's this exercise of actually thinking about the trade-offs in the cash flow and discount rate effects is a really important point. I would love to have done it for the time period in question. The trouble is that because of high inflation in a lot of these countries, the bond market data you have in sort of the 70s and 80s is not wonderful. But I'm still hoping that one day I'll actually be able to do something significant with that because I think it's an important point. So I want to really allow the audience to jump in because I think Josh did a really good job discussing the paper, and I agree with everything he said.
All right. So maybe I'll take the moderator's privilege here and ask my first question. I was actually going to ask something about debt overhang, but the lawyers looked into it, and evidently Daryl has a pretty solid copyright on asking questions about debt overhang. So I'll turn to another question, which is, so in your paper, the regression results that you report are for all of the episodes, which left me wondering, is there a were the results different when you look at the successful episodes versus the unsuccessful? I could actually see it going in either direction, but I was curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I didn't include those results. I do have those results, and the picture is not qualitatively different. The quantitative, it's slightly different, but not in a way that changes the thrust of things. Yeah.
So I saw John's hand jump up, and Andy, maybe after John. What's that?
Sebastian.
And then Sebastian. And we'll take those three questions.
We
and
started late, too, so we might want to tack on a few minutes, right?
I'll leave that up to the organizers to.
Thanks. I had two quick questions. One, there's nothing like saying there is no episode to lead one to scratching one's mind about episodes. And two come to mind. One is Sargent's methods of Poincaré and Thatcher. Poincaré as a moderate inflation, and by the same mechanisms as the Germans and Austrians stopped that. It was a credible change in regime, fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic, and stopped inflation cold without any output problems. Second, the inflation targeting countries, which aren't in your sample because they're more advanced countries, but New Zealand, Israel, Canada, Sweden, all stopped inflation in its tracks with no recession. why a credible change in regime, fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic growth-oriented regime. So it does seem like it's possible, but that echoes your first comment. Is the U.S. headed there? Well, we're not headed to a credible change of fiscal, monetary, and microeconomic regime, so I would agree with that. Which brings up my second suggestion. You have the data to tell us why some worked and some didn't work, and I suspect I know the answer. I suspect Sebastian's going to tell us more about that at dinner. When the central bank tries to go it alone and you don't solve the fiscal problem and you don't solve the microeconomic growth problem, and maybe even the central bank isn't really committing itself to it, it doesn't work. And when you do solve those things, it does work. So that's an analysis you're ready to go with.
Andy Filardo, Hoover Institution. So this is a really great paper, but my recollection is over the last 2 decades, the disinflationary experience of emerging market economies and small open advanced economies was quite different. Consistent with what John was just saying. We moved from economies with 5 to 10% inflation, some with a few above 10% to below 5%. And those went fairly smoothly. I don't remember the stock market results, but my guess is it was generally strong. Overall, those central banks would say that this was a big welfare improving sort of event. So I think maybe the history and maybe the sample gives you somewhat different implication. Now, I don't think that the sample from these countries suggests that the Fed has an easy track to go forward. Because what they did, which the Fed is not doing, is they started from a place of low confidence in their inflation ability to target. And they built up confidence. And they did that by announcing intermediate inflation targets. They didn't go from 10 to 2. They did 10, then 8, and 7, 6. I was a little skeptical at the time that they'd be able to achieve that, but they did. Now, the Fed has gone backwards. It's lost its credibility for inflation targeting. And it seems to suggest that it's just going to go right down to 2%. And I think the Fed is understating to the public the true sense of how confident they are to get that. If the Fed were to announce intermediate inflation targets, learning from the example of these moderate inflation reductions, I think they do a lot better. And I would wonder what your comment might be.
Professor Sebastian?
This is a super interesting paper, which I have not read. So many of the questions maybe are answered in the paper, maybe the issues I'm going to raise. But first a question. You ended in 1994. Okay. So, Peter, that reminded me of our very dear Ron McKinnon and his repression in financial markets. During most of your period, many of these countries didn't have a well-functioning stock market. Maybe some of them didn't even have a stock exchange. So I think that emphasizing the stock market as a methodological issue, as Joshua pointed out, is a great thing, but one would have to look at every one of these countries. So if one were to do what Joshua did, looking at the recent episodes, you looked at Turkey, Mexico, and 2 other countries, Chile just did it, right? Inflation in Chile, it was announced 2 days ago, it's 9.9%. And it was 14%. So it went from moderate to a successful one. Stock market is going up. But it's going up because there's one dominant stock in the index, which is SQM, which is the number 1 or number 2 lithium producer in the world. And this has to do with EVs rather than with, I don't know what it has, and there's also the political issue that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I think that probably the paper has more details. That's very important. The second point is something that Joshua brought up, which is the exchange rate. And the 2 groups of countries have a very different approach to exchange rates. And if you define the attempts as IMF programs, most of the time the IMF asks for a devaluation upfront, right? I mean, you know this better than I do, right? So, but the magnitude of the devaluation is very different across countries. And I think that is something that should be taken into account, or tell us what you guys did about that. And the final point is that I think that you can reinterpret your results. It's less controversial now than it used to be, but as a evaluation of IMF programs. And what you're telling us is that out of 91 or 81 programs, only 8 plus 5 worked out, or 8 plus 2, so, or no, 5 plus 2, so only 7 out of 81. So it's a pretty negative it's a result relative to the effectiveness of IMF programs. And I wonder what you think about that.
So maybe we'll answer those questions and then we'll take another round. Peter, do you have a response?
Thanks for all the comments. I won't go into great detail just in the interest of time, but let me just say a few things. So John, thanks for the Poincaré and Thatcher episodes. I'll go back and look at those and see. I don't remember Dornbush and Fisher talking about the Thatcher episode, but I'll go back and take a look at the data on those. And similarly with the New Zealand, Canada episodes as well. And on the point about, let me tie together 2 points. The question about the low inflation regime we've seen in emerging economies post-1994, and Sebastian's point about 1994. So the reason I kind of broke the sample in 1994 is that starting in 1994, most of the IMF programs we saw in emerging and developing economies, as Rudy Dornbush has pointed out in his work, and I think Sebastian's talked about this as well, were really related to financial crises versus inflation crises. And so for methodological reasons, I take a different approach, but your point is very well taken. In a separate paper that Anusha and I wrote with Hector Reyes, who's a PhD student here at Stanford, and is a part of this PhD Excellence Initiative that I talked about in the beginning on the paper. In that paper, we actually, it's called the Baker Hypothesis, it's in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2021. We show that a big part of the acceleration in growth that happens in emerging and developing economies, which happens precisely kind of post-1994, is because in 1994 we see inflation dropping like a stone in the emerging. Basically on the order of, it's close to 40% per year in the early 90s, and it falls radically in 1994 and 1985, and then is basically in single digits until 2021. And so the bigger message, which I should have emphasized here, is that getting rid of inflation has been a huge boon to growth in emerging and developing economies, right? But there are important political economy questions about, to Sebastian's point, how effective is the IMF in actually getting countries to stay the course, but particularly in moderate inflation cases. Because we know that, again, from the data, that once you sort of get there, there are a lot of benefits, but the transition path in there can actually be quite hard, and the IMF doesn't seem to add much value. To Sebastian's point. On Sebastian's point about the methodological challenges to the exchange rate and so forth, I didn't mention very much in the talk, but we do address those issues. And many of the even in the high inflation cases, to your point, there are a lot of exchange rate based stabilizations. Controlling for all those things, the results still go through. But I do think that the broader question that a lot of folks have alluded to in terms of thinking about the relative effective discount rates versus cash flows, but also really digging in more deeply into sort of what was it about the fiscal side that didn't happen in the unsuccessful cases, and really just trying to understand more generally, why was it like for example, in the sample, the country with the most failed IMF programs is Jamaica, where I'm from. Actually, there's 11 failed IMF programs in the sample. And then I actually was in Jamaica in 2017 when Christine Lagarde actually went to Jamaica to have a major IMF conference because Jamaica finally successfully completed an IMF program. So what is it that, for 11 straight programs over a course of 40 years, you fail, and then suddenly you actually get a successful program. And I do think that's really actually worth digging into, and it's probably, dare I say it, a book or something. As I'm looking at my colleague John Cochran, who's written a fantastic book, but it took him quite a long time to complete it. I'm not sure I have the same amount of temerity he does. But let me stop there.
Jim and Mike and Andy and the gentleman in the back there who I don't know.
Jim Bullard, St. Louis Fed. So I love this paper. I've been an advocate of the Sargent School that says that maybe you can get a soft landing out of this. There is a paper, a famous paper by Goodfriend and King called The Incredible Volcker Disinflation. So it says that the reason the Volcker disinflation was costly was because Volcker had to earn credibility. And so there's some learning going on, and there's initially it's not credible. He has to prove credibility. This causes a big disruption in the economy. But the alternative to that is if you have more credibility, then you have more chance of a soft landing and a immaculate disinflation. So I think the modern Fed has a lot more credibility than Volcker had going into the big inflation in the early 80s. And so I think we have more chance of success because of that. There's also a paper that takes that across country. It's by Gibbs and Coolish. They have a model that has learning and time-varying credibility, and then they assign, the costly disinflations were the ones that were not credible, and the less costly disinflations were the ones that were more credible. So they've got estimates on that across borders, a different sample than what you have here. I think more post-1994 than what you have here. So, but very good. I like also the emphasis on trying to look at equity pricing as a way to get the metric on whether the disinflation was costly or not. So.
Yeah, this just amplifies something that John Cochran said. So I've done a lot of research with Pierre Siklos on emerging countries, and we looked at IT, at inflation targeting, across a big panel of countries. We did this for the Central Bank of Chile, and we found that countries that adopted IT did much better. They did much better in lowering inflation and in their economic performance. But the data we look at goes to the beginning of your period, but goes up to the present. So I think that IT and the strategies you follow, and that we also found is tied in with what was just said that Jim said about credibility, that it took time to earn credibility to be able to do that.
Yeah, really great paper. Following up on what Mike said, so we have a Hoover working paper that was last year that was published in the IMF Economic Review, what we call the quiet revolution in monetary policy. The paper is focused on low-income countries, so it's actually maybe even below the sample that you're looking at, which is emerging markets. But it's really been dramatic over the last 25 years that most low-income countries have succeeded in bringing inflation down, not just to single digits, but actually in most cases below 5%. Now that's African countries, sub-Saharan African countries. It's countries in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, ones that we don't often talk about in this auditorium, some in Southeast Asia, but there has been a lot of experience. And the reason I want to emphasize this, because it builds on the same legacy we talked about this morning, John Taylor's legacy, systematic monetary policy frameworks, clear strategy. You start with a clear goal. Of course, you need an independent monetary policy. The central bank has to be insulated from political interference. But I would say that actually the IMF over the last 20 years has been remarkably effective through technical assistance and other kinds of support, not these rescue missions so much, but the ongoing technical assistance in helping many of these low-income countries to achieve pretty good monetary policy frameworks that have been quietly successful year after year. So I urge you, Peter, extend the sample into there, and maybe that would connect to what you're saying about Jamaica. Maybe we could collaborate on it, but I think it's definitely, there's lots more lessons learned there.
Hi, Peter Blair, Harvard and Hoover. I just wanted to commend the use of data from developing countries to understand macroeconomic policy in the United States. I think it's a huge conceptual leap and one that brought me into the profession, because I think oftentimes development economists and macroeconomists view developing countries a bit cynically in terms of saying, how can we provide them with micro interventions, whether it's bed nets or something like that. But what you're really saying is that we can learn lessons from those countries. And I think you quite rightly foregrounded that in the presentation. I hope that it's very foregrounded in the paper, and that for all of us in the audience here, as we teach students, that we bring that lens, that there are policy experiments happening around the world, macroeconomic policy experiments, not just in developed countries, but in developing countries that we can learn from.
And then one last question.
Hi, I just got to say something about John Taylor. This is not about the Taylor rule. I don't quite understand it. This guy over there when he was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs from 2000 to 2004, went to Iraq and set up the central bank with a number of Iraqis. And that central bank has had one devaluation in the last 20 years, and it just got reversed, and when the currency went up against the dollar. And the country is booming, and so it's just it's another version of the Taylor rule.
All right. Any final comments, Josh and Peter?
No, thanks very much.
Just last quickly, I'll say, I think appropriately connecting John Gunn's point, John Taylor's had enormous impact, obviously, even on inflation targeting. And I think the point is well taken. I certainly hope the Fed has enough credibility to get us back to 2% quickly and painlessly. My suspicion is that it's going to be harder than people realize, and I think the biggest measure of that is, frankly, right now, the difference between where the Fed thinks rates are going to be and where the market thinks rates are going to be. But the lesson in emerging economies is deep, and the inflation targeting was a big part of it. And my only point there is that, as I mentioned the Chilean example specifically because it was a more gradual approach taken in a part of a broader strategy. And the Fed has made it very clear they want to get inflation down to 2% really quickly. And so that's where I think we're looking at a different scenario. But as my 14-year-old likes to say, time will tell.
Thank you. Fantastic.